ladies and gentlemen. I think most of you have taken your seats, but not all. Could everybody come to order? First of all, on behalf of the Danube Institute, may I welcome you to this very interesting occasion and say how impressive it is that so many people have come in from what is an absolutely wonderful day outside. and we attribute this to the fact that the speaker, Paul de Quenoy, is obviously got something very important to say. He's got something very important to say about topics that are very much in the news. I've just come almost directly from the National Conservative Conference in London, and I think I see a speaker from that occasion, the editor of the European Conservative at the back here, with pen in hand. And on this occasion, the revelation that the conference gave the rest of us was the extent of the growing divisions and arguments within conservatism. I would say that this is common to almost all conservative parties, but is particularly acute in the conservative parties of the Anglosphere. Of course, they're not always called conservative, but broadly speaking, the centre-right and right-wing parties in the Anglosphere particularly are riven by divisions. I would single out two. The first is that, of course, there are the normal divisions which exist in the large umbrella parties that are created or fostered by the first-past-the-post system. So on this occasion, you did have a genuine, serious, important, and relatively well-mannered and convivial debates between people who you might call them in the English context Thatcherites, people who believe that getting the economy, a free economy right is one of the most important things a conservative government can do. And on the other hand, people who thought that the big questions that conservatives must press today are questions of preserving the nation, strengthening the family, and in generally providing a more strongly based and more decent culture. Now, again, those arguments are not, they're indefinite. They will never end. But on this occasion, I would say, they were arguments in which the economists, the Thatcherites, were, so to speak, on the defensive. I think with strong people on that side, that defense is going to be continued and advanced, and I myself have a sympathy with it. The second division between everybody there was really a division between leaders and led. The conference, of course, had leaders there, but they were, in the context of everyday politics, they weren't the leaders in the sense that the heads of conservative governments or ministers in conservative administrations are leaders. There were several impressive members of parliament, and there were several impressive ministers from the conservative government. And that was also true of earlier national conservatism conferences in America. But there is absolutely no disguising the fact that the leaders of conservative parties at the moment are leaders who have lost the confidence and the trust of the people that they presume to lead. You can see this in opinion polls. You can see it in rows within parliaments and Congress and the op-ed pages of newspapers. But you could feel it at this conference very strongly. And although, as I say, the arguments and debates were good-humored, they were seriously felt on both sides, I believe. And that promises for a difficult time in the future for conservatives, because divided parties don't generally win elections. At least that's one of the truths which psephologists tell us cannot be defied. But although there will be some difficulties, as a result of this, and maybe lost elections. A lot of the people there were making remarks that suggested they don't mind losing elections if it means that the party that emerges from the defeat, as, for example, the Republican Party did emerge from the defeat at the hands of Jimmy Carter, or earlier at the hands of Lyndon Johnson. If the Republican Party is, well, not a purer, but a more conservative party. So those arguments both those sets of arguments are going on now to address this question, or these questions, with a particular relationship, in this case to Hungary. Our speaker, Paul de Quenoy, is today is very well fitted to address this very thorny topic for three reasons. First of all, he has a distinguished academic career as a historian, which not only encompasses the United States, but also the universities, the American universities in Cairo and in Beirut, where for some years he was a lecturer. Secondly, he is the president and publisher of the academic press in the United States, a press which seriously presents strong and effective arguments across the board, but particularly his company is a place to go where to find strong conservative authors who sometimes find in the present woke atmosphere of publishing it hard to get a publisher or attention. Thirdly, he is the founder and head of the Palm Beach Freedom Institute. Now, I will let you in on a dangerous secret here. Palm Beach is one of the most politically influential places in the United States. And that is because it is where donors live, particularly Republican donors. And the fact that he has a direct access to one of the most, and also from my own experience of several visits there, it's a place in which political conversation never really stops. You don't expect that to be true of places where I always thought that people went there for the beach, but no. They go there for political debate and argument, and I think for political change. And it's a much more conservative town than people realize or expect. It's the kind of opposite of, what's that island off the coast of Massachusetts? Martha's Vineyard. It's the political polar opposite of Martha's Vineyard. So, our speaker today, therefore, is well equipped and fitted to deal with this question. I'm delighted to welcome him. After he has spoken, I will ask my colleague, David Martin-Jones, the Director of Research at the Institute, to respond in some way, and then we'll have a three-way conversation. But to begin with, Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming today. Some of you may know I was meant to deliver this lecture a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, but I got a really serious respiratory infection. And I thought it was COVID. I tested negative twice, but I think I would have been medically checked off the plane if I had tried to fly. So I decided not to come, and the Institute very graciously agreed to postpone it to another occasion. But it took a year to do it, and I'm told that you've had the nicest weather now since last fall. So I'm happy to bring that Palm Beach sunshine as well as our accumulated political wisdom to you here today. When I go home, I'm going to tell them that Palm Beach got a round of applause from the audience. So again, thank you. I'm glad in a way that we had this delay because this phenomenon that I call Vichy conservatism in the United States has developed and expanded substantially in the past year. There are even some developments in the last few weeks that I can share with you. The concept, of course, comes from the Second World War. In my university career, I taught the Second World War class for 11 years. It was by far the most popular course on campus. In my final performance evaluation as a university professor, my department chairman said that my teaching was of marginal relevance to the mission of the history department. Guess why? They couldn't stand the idea, first of all, that it was a more popular class than theirs, all right, but also that it was a military history course in a discipline, academic history, that now disfavors military history and diplomatic topics. This is the stuff of white male aggression and something that's very much not taught anymore. It's hard to find serious military historians in university history departments today. So the idea of a Vichy conservative occurred to me around August of 2021 when I was watching the visits of Tucker Carlson and other prominent American conservatives like Rod Dreher and Patrick Deneen, who came here to Hungary for a conference hosted for, I think, conservative youth. And normally, that wouldn't attract a huge amount of attention. Right-wing Americans go to a conference in a foreign country. Well, so what? This is a pretty normal thing. The media in America exploded, denouncing all of these people for coming. It was said that they were nihilists, that they were bent on the destruction of America, that they opposed the Constitution, that they were against democracy, that they were doing terrible, terrible things that proved they had no soul because they came to Hungary to meet with young Hungarians and discuss conservative ideas. Imagine what they'd say about CPAC. Well, you don't have to imagine. They actually do say it about CPAC. So that got me thinking, who are these people? And the criticism was largely coming from people who would be identified or would once have been identified as neoconservatives, people like David Frum and Applebaum, prominent journalists still in American life who have departed from what we would call traditional conservatism and embraced something new. And I said, well, why are they so angry? And why are they so exercised by this idea that their colleagues on the right would visit another country with a right-wing government? So the concept of Vichy then fundamentally comes out of World War II. We all know, I think, if you're familiar with the war or the film Casablanca, what does Vichy stand for? Most of all, collaboration. And this was a word that the Vichy government itself used. It was value neutral at that time. It didn't mean you were doing something sinister. To collaborate with somebody simply meant, as you can guess from the Latin root, to work together. What they were working with in World War II was Nazi Germany. At the time the Vichy government was formed in July 1940, it was far from clear that Germany would lose World War II, which of course it did, and probably even less clear that people who collaborated with it in a political context in Nazi-dominated Europe would face severe punishment after the war, which of course also happened. Vichy then was conceived as a project to collaborate with the Germans to advance either personal ambition or to mitigate loss in terrible circumstances. It occurred to me that this would be an appropriate term for the American right because this is precisely what we've seen, particularly among the leadership of the Republican Party and many of the people affiliated with its media outlets or historically affiliated with its media outlets in the United States. They're willing to collaborate with a hegemonic power, not Nazi Germany, thank God in this case, but rather with the establishment, liberal, democratic, blue state sensibilities that are in control of our big cities, that control education, the media, and other important parts of our culture. And that by collaborating with them, they are assured at least some kind of place, perhaps not a leading place, but a respectable place in what might be the future of American politics. If you want to use another analogy, since we are in Eastern Europe, they also resemble in some ways fellow travelers, which is to say non-communist intellectuals who were permitted to continue doing their work in their particular fields in Eastern European countries during the Cold War, as long as they never challenged the dominant narrative or structures of the Communist Party in each country. Right? You could have a reasonable life if you didn't raise any important political question, but rather kept your thoughts to yourself and continued being a paleontologist or working in linguistics or whatever your particular career was. The Vichy conservatives in America are very much enjoying or have enjoyed that collaboration. Now, the first question, of course, is why would they do this? Why would you abandon traditional conservative principles? Why would you become enemies with people you were once friends with in the name of getting along with the dominant narrative regime that we see in America? And the phrase regime media very much, I think, is apposite and appears very much in our discourse. Major reason is that they indeed can mitigate loss and figured out that they can have rather comfortable lives if they are willing to surrender control of cultural and educational politics to the radical left in our country. Right? They can even have a space to advocate for what they believe conservatism should be, which would be a right-wing fiscal, economic, and foreign policy without suffering much trouble. And you could say, well, what would they really suffer from by dissenting in the way that national conservatives or majority, it is very much majority conservatives in America believe in? Well, to be very simple, your life as a blue state resident becomes a lot easier if you give up on this matter of principle. Right? If you are willing to surrender your convictions, you can, in fact, enjoy a great existence. You can have what I call a blue state social life. What does that mean, a blue state social life? You can live in Washington or New York, and your friends will still talk to you. We're talking about places where 90%, up to 90% of people vote for the Democratic Party. We're talking about places where people will not speak to you or maintain a friendship with you if you voted for Donald Trump in 2016 or in 2020. I can share innumerable stories, having spent 10 years in Washington when I was a student, university and then graduate school and some professional work, about how people are treated. These days you can be harassed in restaurants if it's known that you are of the political right. People will protest your home. This is what happened to Tucker Carlson not long before he came to Hungary. It's also happened recently to American Supreme Court justices who found against abortion rights in America. We had one case of an assassination plot against Justice Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh was one of the majority votes in the case that overturned Roe versus Wade. Your life can be in danger. Your physical safety, the safety of your family can come into question if you espouse ideas of the American political right in our blue state environments today. Your professional opportunities will shrink. Your ability to work in your field will be circumscribed. I can tell you from my own field, 41% of university professors say that they would not care to have lunch with someone who voted for Donald Trump. It's just lunch, as the phrase goes. But still, this is thought to be beyond the pale of acceptability. Now, what happens if you become a Vichy conservative? You can still have some of your political beliefs, and you can say, well, I think a bit differently from you about taxes or something like this. But by and large, we agree that there should be a dominant narrative, and I'm willing to put pronouns in my Twitter biography and willing to call people they upon their insistence that they're not he, she, but they, them. And I am willing to mouth all the shibboleths of liberal hegemony in American cities without making any trouble or raising any concern, and certainly not doing anything to fight back on any level. Then, properly neutered, you can be a respectable blue state resident. People will still talk to you. They'll still invite you to their awful cocktail parties. They'll make play dates so that your kids can play with their kids. Isn't that nice? You wouldn't want to give that up, would you? Of course you would. And what you realize when you move out of that environment to a place like Palm Beach, which has become, South Florida generally, a center for American right-wing intellectuals, particularly in media, is that those distinctions disappear. When you go to your doctor's office and they're playing Newsmax, which is the right-wing alternative now to Fox News, you see greatly more openness toward this. You can actually exist having conversations that you would have to whisper or not have at all in New York and Washington. You can have them openly in Florida without any problems for yourself, your family, or anything. Rather, it's the other way around. You go to dinner parties and there's somebody who's a Democrat and say, "Oh, wow, you're the Democrat." We're just nicer to them. We don't run them off. We don't have to. We wouldn't. It would be illiberal. It's what they would do, right? So the Vichy conservatives have that basic motivation, survival and acceptability. On a higher level, if you really are willing to sell out, we have rewards for you if you want to work in the Vichy conservative movement. You can become a conservative columnist even in a very radical left paper like the New York Times. Remember that the New York Times just 3 years ago fired its opinion page editor for publishing an op-ed piece written by a sitting United States senator who expressed a view that was favored by nearly 60% of Americans that military force could be used to contain riots associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. He was forced from his job, and then one of their star columnists who defended him was forced from her job too, and now runs her own, this is Barry Weiss, runs her own independent press organization. The same paper, of course, has no problem hiring people like David French. We call him Vichy French, get it? Who has now very recently become a New York Times columnist and publicly said things like drag shows that sexualize gender divisions are a blessing of liberty. Yes, he said this in public long before he was a New York Times columnist, but his expressed in these ways signaled to this dominant narrative that he is in fact part of it, that he won't resist it, and that as long as his existence is tolerated, he will put his talents in their service. Right? We have people who have been rather bedrock conservatives who are willing to make that transition, to use a transgender ideology word, to something else, to something other than what they were, if it means getting paid, preserving their existence, having their blue state social lives, and reaching levels of respectability, even to the point where they will viciously attack people like me, like Tucker Carlson, who would come here to Hungary and espouse opposing viewpoints. How does that play out in our politics? How powerful are these people really? In terms of what we know from public opinion polls, and all the figures I would cite would come from Gallup and similar organizations that are politically independent, they would only represent something like 10 to 15% of Republicans nationally. The other 85 to 90% of American Republicans disagree with the Vichy conservative ideology. They hold bedrock conservative positions across the board on virtually every subject. So 10 to 15%, does that make them a force in our electoral politics? No. As we saw, particularly in the 2016 Republican election, for the race for the nomination won by Donald Trump, the Vichy conservative candidates, or the more moderate Republicans, got creamed. Trump simply annihilated them because his views aligned more closely with the populist views held by most American conservatives. That is to say, conservatives who live outside of these metropolitan areas where their jobs, social lives, and even their safety depends on not dissenting from a dominant narrative. Within the recent developments, we have seen that this has more or less persevered. The American right today still embraces Trump as the leading candidate for the Republican nomination in 2024. This is despite his previous electoral problems. This is despite his legal difficulties. This is despite the attempts to create more scandal around him. Right? He is the preferred candidate of well over probably 60% of Republicans, and beating the next closest one, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, in the most recent poll I saw, the Harvard-Harris poll published this weekend, by 42 points. The neoconservative leftovers, the Vichy Cons in the major cities, resent this deeply and are very agitated by it. In their discussion groups, in their media, if you read publications like The Dispatch, and there's no reason you should, but if you do, or The Bulwark, they talk to each other about their great hope that maybe the party members someday will come to their senses and realize that we should be their proper leaders. And these are people who had some say in national politics maybe 20 years ago, but no longer do. Wish they did. And they're now making that argument to each other. It's a kind of mass wishful thinking that they might one day be swept back into positions of power and authority, because Trump's problems will prove that this more national conservative vision is fundamentally wrong, and that the proper focus of Republican politics, of right-wing politics in America, would be on economic issues rather than social and cultural issues, which seem ever more important. I think they're deluding themselves. They do have an outsized voice in the party because a great many of them have, as I said, prominent media positions. They also control a great deal of the institutional life in think tanks in Washington and New York, in the traditional organizations that sort of urban Republicans feel more comfortable with, that have an institutional memory. And they're frightened. When you talk to them, they feel like they are losing their influence. Can they ever possibly regain it? And I think this is probably the most important part of the talk. No, this is the glorious future. They never bothered to cultivate any group of acolytes or disciples or young people who would carry on their ideas. They would say, well, we're more pragmatic than the national conservatives who dominate American politics. The younger Republicans overwhelmingly reject this. And interestingly, if you look at inter-party polls or intra-party polls in the Republican Party, the younger the group of voters you're talking to, the more likely they are to support President Trump. It's the older groups that would break for an alternative candidate more readily than the younger ones. Part of that is rebellion against what they see as a patronizing structure, a structure that's been maintained by sellouts, by people who, like the Vichy politicians of the 1940s, figured out that they could get a better place in a world that is dying by selling out their most dearly held principles. And it's something that they don't want to have, right? And of course, the Vichy Cons themselves, the neoconservative movement, did itself very few favors by not cultivating a new generation of leadership. By and large, those people the younger people reject them. And so they seem to be heading for extinction. And they're ever more sort of incoherent. Their ideas have less and less traction. And they seem more and more ridiculous, frankly. And I think that's probably the best word for them, is ridiculous. They literally make you laugh because what they're trying to do in their criticism is so transparent. It's so easy to see through. It's so obvious that they're out for a piece of whatever the establishment cities can offer them, that they will be willing to do almost anything to try to keep some notion of power, some pretense to relevance, and will work very hard to make sure that they stay there. And as we see, I think, the development of conservatism in America, its center of gravity is very much moving out of the traditional capitals. And I mean that quite literally. During the pandemic and with the associated violence, large numbers of people left blue state America. So many people left the state of New York that it actually lost a seat in Congress in the last census in 2020. It would probably lose another one today. And the recipients of these refugees, if you will, are places like Florida and Texas, red states that have much better horizons for opportunity, for self-expression, for the ability just not to be forced into this terrible environment where the wrong slip-up in politically correct terms can mean the ruin of your career, the end of your life as a social person, and essentially the failure of you to promote your ideas. Florida, particularly where I live, is a much more welcoming environment for diverse opinions. You can say pretty much anything you want. And to have an institute like ours, the Palm Beach Freedom Institute, functioning there has taken off in ways that we never would have imagined. In fact, I can tell you a little bit about the origin of it, since it does tie into this topic today. One of the Vichy conservative institutes from Washington, I won't say which, sent down fundraising teams, which they do about once a year, to more or less entertain the big donor class in Palm Beach with their ideas. And frankly, the presentation was terrible. It was boring. I think the speaker took one question from the audience. It was a completely uninteresting event. I turned to a friend of mine who had invited me. I said, this was awful. Why don't we have our own conservative discussion group here in Palm Beach? And he said to me, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to have an institute, and you're going to be the president of it. That's not great. Just what I need, more responsibility. So my idea of meeting for drinks once a week became an institute now of international significance with this talk today. Here we are in Budapest, just 2 years after we were founded. It's been a wild ride, founding it, developing it, and receiving support not just from our community in Palm Beach, but really from all over the country and indeed all over the world. Because we are able to stand up for our beliefs, we are able to advocate our ideas and our ideology without reference to the traditional think tank world in Washington and New York. And the phone calls I get are, again, ridiculous. And this is the best word, because they're calling to ask, what can we in Palm Beach do for their Vichy conservative outfits in our decaying capitals? And the answer is usually nothing. We don't need you. There's nothing to talk about. It's like, but you don't mean that, Paul. Don't you need our expertise? No, the last thing I want is your expertise. Don't you want us to help you? It's like, what are you telling me? You're from Washington and you're here to help me? Right? That's one of the oldest and worst cliches in American politics, the idea that the government is the solution to your problems. As Ronald Reagan said, government is the problem all too often. And so that it goes. My own experience, I think, reflects this larger phenomenon. And indeed, if you want to look again at the national politics of this, when we had disappointing results in the midterm elections of November 2022, many of the Vichy conservatives, people like Bill Kristol, people like David French, people like David Frum, went into the media, their establishment media, and said, now is the time for someone to challenge Trump. DeSantis clearly has the mandate. He should do it. And there's always this caveat, the little asterisk says, and he needs our help. So we should work for him. What do they mean by this? They mean that at least at that time, they entertained the fantasy that they could get into the entourage of Ron DeSantis and likely try to influence his policies and administration should he run for president. And we still have to couch this in should he run for president, even though he's expected to announce his candidacy this week. And possibly if he should have an administration, they would hope to play some kind of role in that process as well. I think he's smart enough to avoid that trap. I think he knows that they are a discredited group of people. And I think the people around DeSantis in Florida, which, again, that in itself is a big fault, a shifting fault line because he's losing support now. But a lot of people around him would warn him about what Vichy conservatism is and what it could do to his potential for leadership should he be the choice of the American people in the future. As for Trump, we did actually see some Vichy conservative recidivism during the Trump administration. You may recall that in the realm of foreign policy, hundreds of Vichy conservative or neoconservative foreign policy experts published open letters in the journal War on the Rocks saying that they would never work for a Trump administration. I think they did it at the time because they didn't expect Trump to win the Republican nomination and probably also not the presidency. It's a great way to virtue signal that you're against this. When he did, in fact, win both the nomination and the presidency, some of those people crawled back and didn't get into positions of major authority or power, but nevertheless were able to join, in some cases, join the administration in lesser positions or find some new relevance. And if you ask Trump today, this is a frequent interview question, President Trump, what do you think were the major mistakes of your administration? The first thing he will say is personnel. And he believes that the personnel choices he made compromised his ability to accomplish much of his announced program and platform. As he went through his administration, my impression is that he believed the federal bureaucracy, the civil service, and especially the Republican Party and its officials would be loyal to him as the President of the United States. Not a completely unrealistic assumption. Right? But at the same time, they very much had their own agenda, their own ideas. He is aware of that. People who had served in his administration, who would likely serve potentially in a second Trump administration, tell me frequently that he is all about cleaning house and making sure that these people have no further influence. So when you watch what they say in the media about Trump's candidacy, about Trump's potential for being the nominee again and potentially the president again, know that their anger and their focus on damaging Trump to the highest extent possible, the greatest magnitude, fundamentally is a function of their realization that if he should win, their day is over. With another candidate, they might have some chance. With Trump, they have zero chance. Now, as the president of a tax-exempt organization in the United States, I don't make endorsements. But if you oppose Vichy conservatism, if you don't want those ideas to function on the American right anymore, they would need to be disempowered through your choice of presidential nominee. Right? And in this case, it seems like Trump is far less likely than any other candidate to advance in that direction. So I'm looking forward to the rest of our discussion. I hope I've given you good food for thought today. And thank you all for coming.
David, may I ask you to, whatever, here or there, which you?
So that was tremendous and very illuminating for us all. The only two things I probably wanted to say was, aren't you doing Vichy a disservice in that the Vichy regime was quite an interesting one in some ways. The situation in 1940 was either you joined the resistance, the Free French, or you made a deal. And the deal that Pétain made in the circumstances can, in some senses, be understood, or at least, historically we can see reasons for it. And in a sense, what the Vichy stood for, they were collaborationists, as Paul rightly said, but collaboration at the time had, as you said, a kind of neutral quality. And even the United States recognized the Vichy regime. Roosevelt recognized it. And what it stood for, actually, in terms of its own values, was it was anti-democratic. It was very different from Paul's Vichy conservatives in America. The key thinkers were not uninteresting figures in some ways. They were hideously anti-Semite, but in terms of their political shtick, it was really monarchism, a distrust of democracy, and a belief in French civilization as a moral force. Its key thinkers were people like Charles Marat and the very interesting and sometimes disturbing novelist Louis-Ferdinand Céline. So these people were also intensely Catholic. They wanted a Catholic monarchist France. They were all Leonist. And interestingly, the French right at the moment, or the conservative movements in France, are looking again at some of Marat's ideas. So I suppose the point I would make, being an academic like Paul, is that actually the Vichy regime was in some ways far more admirable than the Vichy conservatives in America at the moment. The other point I thought is that why is it, so why is it that this ideology of the Vichy conservatives that Paul identifies has achieved such moral authority, even though it's completely decadent and incoherent, as Paul pointed out? And one of our problems seems to be that we suffer from a strange moral imperialism about our own cultural enlightenment. There is a sort of sense that the West is universal, that a lot of the pathology that Paul identified comes from the view that at the end of history, the West was the only way in which progress would be sustained universally. And the values of the West had to be translated to the non-West in a way that always assumed a Western superiority, a sort of, I think John called it at one point, a liberal Olympianism. And that's the sort of thinking that currently pervades the Vichy conservative elements in Republican and British politics. And it assumes that our cultural enlightenment impels many people, particularly the elite, to appease the demands of others in order to demonstrate our own reasonableness and tolerance. The general drive of the politico-moral mind for a kind of moral immaculacy resulting from apologies for yesterday's vices and a conspicuous consumption of virtue in contemporary politics misapplies individual moral standards to a collective one. And this is part of the incoherence of the ideal. But the ideal is a moral supremacist idealism, which is ultimately an illusion. And that illusion is something that I think we need to understand in order to take it apart. The sort of rejection of part of it, on the left, but also seemingly subscribed to by elements on the Vichy right, assumes the rejection of modernity as somehow capitalist. And that comes not from critics outside the West, but from within Western culture itself. Other cultures never worried about inequality. They took it for granted. It might follow from this that the critics would respond by emigrating to other cultures that are, more to their taking or more to their liking. But this is clearly not the case. It is not only that the critics of capitalism stick very, very firmly to their Western comforts, they also, at the same time, millions are trying to escape other cultures because the West is so attractive. This sort of moral incoherence that we suffer from at the moment doesn't seem to be going away very quickly. And on that note, I think I'll finish.
Well, since you both spoke, and I get to respond and ask the first question, I want to suggest that the essence of Vichyism, so to speak, which I'm applying to both Vichy and to the situation of moderate conservatives who feel uncomfortable leading a more conservative electorate. In the case of Vichy, defeatism was to some degree understandable because France had just been defeated, but there was a deeper defeatism in that Vichy in two ways. First of all, because you had accepted your role as a defeated nation and power, At that point, you became a kind of a tin can tied to the tail of the German dog in the Second World War. And indeed, the Vichy did come to a point in which they could only defend France's honor in any way by rebelling. And in fact, that's what happened at a certain point in which the Vichy hardliners took over, and those people in Vichy who'd been, in a sense, honorable proponents of we've lost, we have to accept that, found themselves, out of politics altogether in a way. Let me just say that there was in Vichy, however, a deeper defeatism. In 1940, if you were French, I know we're not going to talk too much about Vichy itself, but in 1940, if you were French, you actually had three choices, as David said. You could accept, you could be a defeatist and become a German vassal in greater or lesser extent. Secondly, you could become a communist, and the communists were a power. And furthermore, a lot of ordinary French people thought that, and following the Nazi-Soviet pact with some justice, that they were facing a kind of united totalitarian alliance, which was just doom, and they had to find some way of resisting it. That way was, of course, and some just were quietist, but the third way was to join de Gaulle, or to sympathize with de Gaulle, or become a resistant. That didn't look, I mean, frankly, if you look purely at the odds of the situation for facing a Frenchman in 1940, that third option seemed the least attractive in one sense, in that you just felt when you were bound to lose. That is another kind of defeat. But in fact, of course, it turned out to be the winner. Not right away, because when after D-Day, when French politics came back into reality, the communists could have taken over, and indeed most people thought that they would. But de Gaulle rallied enough of the people who took the first option, the third option, I should say, that of saying, well, we are actually believers in democracy. We hate the twin totalitarianisms, and we're going to fight as best we can and survive. That turned out to be the winning issue. Not, however, until 1989, because France remained divided between Democrats and left totalitarians for the next, well, I would say the next 30 years. It was Solzhenitsyn's testimony that changed all that. Now, the other, in the sense, what about Vichyism in the case of the Western conservative politics? Well, I think that there is a very obvious case that Vichyism was proved to be a mistake, and it happened in America under Reaganism, and it happened in Britain under Thatcherism. This is something which some of my culturally conservative friends don't really want to accept. But the fact is, if you read Margaret Thatcher's, the introduction to her memoirs, there's an introduction in which she says, after the vote in the Parliament bringing about a general election, she's riding back and she's thinking in the car about what this means. And she reflects on the way in which the Conservative Party in the previous 20 or 30 years had drifted in the direction of really a kind of a defeatism-colored acceptance of the left's social and economic policy. And she then says that this produced a real problem for the leaders. Churchill is not included in this critique, by the way. She thinks he's a different case. But the critique is that the leaders of the Conservative Party, she said, were conspicuously honorable men and women in their private dealings. But they thought it compatible with their honor to tell political lies in order to get their party to accept changes that they thought inevitable, but that their own voters disliked and opposed. Now, that's, I think, a perfectly fair description of the kind of moderate Vichyites at the top of conservatism for most of the post-war period, to use this terminology. I think the terminology Vichyite is, of course, not very appealing to anybody on that side. But having said that, she and Reagan in the mollifying, agreeable, charming way, she in a hard, logical, tough, confrontational way said, no, we've gone down that path before. We know how that movie ends, and we're not going to do it again. And she won 3 elections in a row. Reagan transformed the American economy and banished American self-doubt. And the two of them won the Cold War. Now, I thought at that point, well, the kind of moderacy, someone on the left once called it, the kind of moderation that they had defeated. Well, it had been defeated, hadn't it? I mean, she demonstrated that solid, respectable, conservative policies could win electorally and politically. And yet, almost immediately, and I think this happened under George Bush I, that coalition of conservatives united around the policies of the Thatcherite period, of the Reagan-Thatcher period, began to dissolve. They lost again we got 8 years of Clinton and so on and so on. And we never recovered the strong position that Reagan had bequeathed and that the Cold War seemed to have consolidated. So that's the problem. You've got to ask, why is it that we fled, that our opponents here fled from defeat? Understandable. But to flee from success? What explains that? And yet it has to be explained. This is my last point. To my culturally conservative friends who want to, in England, who want to abandon Thatcherism. Of course, Margaret Thatcher's policies were the right ones for the time. We have different problems now. She created a new status quo. That status quo has now got its own problems, and we have to solve them. So I don't believe we should simply apply wholesale everything that she wanted to do and did in the 80s. That would be foolish. But for a faction of conservatives to make as the basis, the foundation of their policy, a rejection of the most successful conservative leader and government in both countries, strikes me as balmy, mad as daft as a brush, to use a comedian's term. And I think that's why this is such an important issue. Now, having said that, I want to ask you what in your view, moving from the kind of political analysis, Paul, both David, what in your view is the single biggest issue in which a conservative policy is disputed between the moderate leadership and the conservative rank and file? What should our attitude be to it, and why?
Well, John, I think you answered your own question in this, because you're absolutely right that it is a case of a Cold War victory that's discarded for loss. And what the loss was something that the Vichy conservatives neglected, the cultural element of our society. You can win a Cold War, you can have favorable Reagan or Thatcherite economic policies without having to address the social and cultural issues. So when we talk about them being defeated, about the right being defeated on these matters, yeah, that's where they lost. And that's where the Vichy conservatives today will say, well, we should just accept that we lost, and that men can get pregnant, and everything else that's in the leftist program, we should just believe in, because fighting it's going to make us look reactionary and old-fashioned, and get us disinvited from all the parties and really end our lives in the big cities. So I think that would be the most important issue today, is the primacy of cultural and social issues. The Vichy conservatives would violently disagree with me about this. In fact, after the last midterm elections in the United States, they did come out in significant numbers and say, yes, we should go back to the 2012 Republican Party program of Mitt Romney and focus exclusively on economics and the boring, wonky kind of policy issues that we remember from Reaganism. Not the totality of Reaganism, but the aspects of Reaganism we remember. And we should ignore the cultural front, because that only ever gets us in trouble. It makes us look like a bunch of extremists, not realizing that most of the conservative movement agrees with cultural conservatism more than it agrees with their kind of cosmopolitan liberalism. So that, to me, would be the major issue dividing the two camps today, the primacy of cultural affairs.
David?
Yeah, is this working? Is that working? So, yeah, okay. Yeah, I completely. Well, I agree with Paul. And John. Really, it's the it's education. You know, how was it that conservatives gave up on education?
David, I think you need to be nearer to
Okay, yeah. How was it that conservatives gave up on education? It was seeming, the Cold War had been won. It had been won not only for economic reasons, it had been won for cultural reasons, with freedom. The central feature of Western culture, the thing that distinguishes the West and makes it a unique culture, is its belief in individualism and individual liberty. And freedom is central to that. For some reason, during the Cold War, or after the Cold War, sorry, and at the end of history, it was assumed that freedom wasn't as important as something like social justice or justice generally. And a sort of liberal elite then became fashionable to dismiss individualism. Even at this National Conservative Conference we were at last week, it was astonishing how people were much more interested in some kind of organic nationalism than the virtue of individualism, which is so central to the ethic of the West and the reason that we won the Cold War in the first place. So, and the other feature, I think, during the post-Cold War era, when this liberal, progressivist, social justice understanding became obsessed not with the individual or the citizen, but the cult of the victim. Somehow you had to find oppressed people everywhere to compensate them for the fact that you came from a successful society and that success was somehow dangerous or damaging or had to be apologized for. So I think that whole failure of conservatism to understand its core values that come out of liberty, the idea of freedom, the idea not of collectivism or collective association, but what Michael Oakeshott called civil association, by joining up in churches or in schools or in parent associations. We create the small groups that are the basis of a successful and integrated society. We gave too much power to elites. We created, under conservative rule, governance, a corporatist structure that is now overbearing upon us, and whose managerial elites are not democratic. They find the people offensive. They're hectoring them about their weight, about whether they smoke, what they drink. The people are not good enough. So one of the reasons why there's so much migration is probably because the elites want a new people.
And also the prospect of being part of that elite is irresistible to your Vichy conservatism. Right? You can, if you mouth the shibboleths, if you agree that men can get pregnant, if you use the correct pronouns, if you do all these other things, right? You can very much be part of that and have a position of some authority while still saying that you are conservative in the finest Reagan traditions, which they do.
Well, let me ask now, we turn to Donald Trump, and for a particular reason. In the last week, we have had the Durham report. And the Durham report is absolutely clear in suggesting that there was an illicit series of bargains between, on the one hand, the media, big tech, the intelligence agencies, and the Democratic Party to ensure, first of all, that the Trump administration never really got off the ground the first time around. It had to spend 2 years, I would say actually 4 years, in combating the accusation that all of these groups either fostered or leveled at Trump, that he was a Russian asset, that he was in league with Putin. Now, the Durham report establishes, first of all, that wasn't true. Secondly, it then establishes that it happened in the following way, that with almost no evidence behind it, it was accepted by all of these different groups for their own purposes. The reason the accusations were made emerged from opposition research financed by the Clinton campaign. It was then treated by the FBI and the intelligence agencies as genuine, as coming from evidence provided by a former MI6 guy. The British said, there's nothing here. But they were turned down. They were politely ignored, even though obviously some of the American intelligence people thought they were correct, but it disappeared. Now, if I would not have put any money at all a month ago on Trump being the candidate, and certainly not on his winning the election next time, you made, Paul, a strong case that he is going to do well. To what extent is this last week's revelations about the Russia hoax? I was about to say, it's hard to choose the right word for what that is. I'm trying to avoid treasonable things like that. But to what extent is that going to actually seriously now affect the campaign and be the basis for a Trump restoration?
I would say not as much as it should, for one very simple reason, that most Americans do not vote on the basis of foreign policy or national security. It's a preoccupation of our elites. It's something that's very popular for discussion in Washington. But overwhelmingly, when you ask American voters, what do you care about most, they'll say the economy. And that's usually followed distantly by topics like illegal immigration, crime, abortion. Terrorism gets single digits, and national security barely even rates. Will this create a major difference in the campaign? In that sense, probably not. I think in the larger sense that people, especially now, you're seeing this among independent voters, the idea that Trump has been treated in an absolutely terrible way by the media, the intelligence agencies, the academic establishment, and everything else that's part of that, that does play well. Because I think Americans at a very basic level are fair, or would like to be thought of as fair. And so when you see, and you notice this in the recent legal issues that President Trump has faced, it's only increased his popularity. He left, his first impeachment caused his popularity to go up by 6 points in his approval ratings. After his second impeachment, he left office, it was about the same time, with the highest approval ratings of his presidency. He got a bounce over DeSantis and the other Republican candidates and potential candidates in the nomination race after he was indicted in what seemed like a very dubious case in New York, essentially a misdemeanor business records offense that was magnified into 34 felonies on the basis of a law that the Manhattan District Attorney failed to identify. Right? 70% of independents came out in the survey saying we believe this is a political prosecution. I think the cumulative effect of things like the Durham report will be to convince people that he's been treated very unfairly, that he's been maligned. And of course, President Trump has no problem telling you that in large capital letters on Truth Social and in other formats. But the actual content itself is probably not something that would interest almost any American voter.
I have a supplement before I turn over to David. You're suggesting that because of these recent developments, Governor DeSantis, who is by most reckoning, I think, a strong candidate, who's had a good record as governor, who takes positions that most conservatives seem to like, and who a month or two ago was actually beating Trump, performing better against named Democratic candidates than Trump was in some polls. First of all, does he still have a chance in your view? I would say yes, but you're the expert. And secondly, if you were giving him advice, what would it be?
Does he have a chance? Well, it's a very long process, right? So we're going into a primary season that won't be decided until next July. So we have 14 months to figure out who the Republican nominee should be. I think one of the most underrated issues, something that's certainly almost never reported, is that for the Republican base, for the non-Vichy conservatives, personal loyalty and political loyalty are extremely important values. And if you know the history of Trump and DeSantis was polling very badly in the nomination race to be governor of Florida in 2018. Donald Trump endorsed him. At that time, he was an unknown congressman, DeSantis. And as a result of the endorsement, he came into the leadership and only very narrowly won the election. He won by like 0.4% over the Democratic Socialist mayor of Tallahassee, who was later completely disgraced in the most Florida way possible. He was found naked and crying with drugs and male prostitutes a few months after his loss, and was recently nearly indicted for financial crimes. It's just like a complete disaster area. But we were 32,000 votes away from having him instead of Ron DeSantis as our governor in COVID, which is frightening. Does he have a chance? Yeah, he does. But as I said, the latest poll, the Harvard-Harris poll, shows Trump with a 42-point lead. And the sense that DeSantis, still prospective DeSantis candidacy, that strikes a lot of Republicans as disloyal. And I think a difference with the Vichy conservatives, they would expect disloyalty. They wouldn't be surprised if politicians were disloyal. They see the world like it's a vast house of cards. Right? Either the British or American version, whichever you prefer. But for the rank and file voters, the sense that DeSantis has to wait his turn, that Trump was fundamentally cheated out of a second term and should be granted another one, is a very powerful idea. What advice would I give DeSantis? I would tell him, if he wanted to run the most effective campaign, to get a national level team. He's relying heavily on his state level advisors who, having dealt with him, in my personal opinion, aren't particularly well suited to national politics or a presidential race. It would be to run a campaign on much broader ideas than what he's been doing. It's true that he was a great governor. Because of Governor DeSantis, we were back eating in restaurants by June and July of 2020. We had more or less, I wouldn't say completely normal, but like 90 to 95% normal lives in the middle of the pandemic when other states and other countries were in severe lockdowns. Right? We became known as the free state of Florida for very good reasons. I think focusing on state politics, as he's been doing lately, fighting against Walt Disney, fighting against drag shows, fighting against bad books. It makes his prospective candidacy look smaller and provincial, as opposed to Trump's, which is national and of much sort of a wider perspective. I would say to DeSantis that he should focus on those national issues and start doing it 5 minutes ago.
Thank you. David.
No, I just had one question for you, really, Paul, about the cases that are mounting against Donald Trump, particularly the female harassment ones. What's the story there, and will that affect his vote?
Well, we know that the impeachments, which I think are much more serious, he was charged with abusing Congress and also inciting an insurrection. A president of the United States was tried by the United States Senate on an insurrection charge. Right? They only increased his popularity. Right? Does that happen with the women case as well? Well, recall that in the case of E. Jean Carroll, she accused him of rape publicly, and the jury found that he didn't do it. It looks like a sandbagging. Right? The jury did find that he had committed sexual assault, but it's on appeal. The circumstances and the facts as they're known in the public have an enormous amount of questions attached to them. I argued in print in Newsmax, my Newsmax column recently, that he should sue her for defamation because, after all, she said in public that he raped her, and a jury found that he did not. Now, if somebody said that about you for 4 years in public, you'd have a pretty good defamation case. Yeah. So she's widely disbelieved, and that's widely seen as a weapon that's used against her. And of course, also her story about what had happened in the dressing room of Bergdorf Goodman's in the 1990s closely resembles the plot of a Law and Order episode, which she was writing for, in which a female victim gets raped while trying on lingerie in the dressing room of Bergdorf Goodman's. So if you believe this, you might not believe anything. And again, I don't think it's the type of issue that would command national attention. After the case of Bill Clinton, who admitted that he lied to a federal grand jury about his affair with an intern in the White House, with no effect on his popularity. I think if he had been able to run for a third term in 2000, he certainly would have won. And we nearly elected his wife. I think that the moral grounds are gone. And remember, that is a massive cultural shift. As recently as 1988, in the candidacy of the Democrat Gary Hart, it was revealed that he was dating a woman while legally separated from his wife, and that was considered morally bad enough that he had to withdraw from the race, which he was leading.
Yes.
David?
Yes, I'm going to move on to questions in a moment. I have one question to raise to you both, which is 3 or 4 times recently, President Biden has said that the biggest national security threat facing the United States is white supremacy and the terrorism that he is arguing it has fostered in the United States. And now, this obviously is a highly contentious charge because, well, there doesn't seem to be evidence for this, but it is being pressed hard by the administration. For example, the Department of Justice has earlier tried to say that parents who protested at school boards, the way that the schools were teaching their children gender theory, were themselves effectively acting in a terroristic way, and this should be investigated, and indeed has on some occasions been investigated. So we have to ask, if that's the case, what do we think the next election is going to be about in one sense? And that is, are both sides to be regarded as engaging in a democratic contest of opinion in which the voters will decide? Or is this a suggestion that some opinions, some political beliefs are so outrageously wicked and lead to terrorism on a vast scale that that really there can't be a fair contest between democratic views and those views, in which case, what will big tech and the media do about allowing both sides to present their case to the American people?
Well, I would say, first of all, that I think the election is going to be highly moralized by the left, and particularly by the Democratic Party. That if you're someone who opposes Democratic candidates, you will be branded ipso facto a racist, that you will be against women's rights, that you will be an uncompassionate person. Who would want to be told that they don't have compassion, right? Certainly not our Vichy conservative friends. But that this will be a positioning of moral high ground, probably unlike we've ever seen. Now, when President Biden talked about white supremacy being the dangerous threat to national security, he was speaking to an all-black university, Howard University, in their commencement address. But whether he really believes that is something I wonder. And certainly by identifying white supremacy as a problem, it distracts attention strategically from the real national security threats, which would include the uncontrolled border in Texas, where we have, I think, upwards of 6 million illegal immigrants having crossed in the past few years, changing potentially the political complexion of the country. It distracts from China, which is certainly recognized by the entire national security establishment. It's actually one of the very few issues on which everybody agrees in Washington, that China is the biggest threat to American national security, right? And of course, doing business with China is, as we've been finding out, very much in the interests not just of the political elite, but also of the Biden family. Right, it takes away from these other issues in importance. And if you can say, you really shouldn't be paying attention to these things that really are threats, but rather to white supremacy as we define it, then yes, they can position themselves better. Your question about the media and big tech is interesting because I think they're starting to become more balanced. Elon Musk's ownership of Twitter has actually reinforced the revelations that there's collusion between the service agencies, the intelligence agencies, and the media and big tech. Disestablishing that seems to be one of his major priorities. Even a lot of the legacy media now, they're realizing that doing this very kind of woke leftist message is costing them a tremendous amount of credibility and, as a result, a tremendous amount of profit. If you look at the polls on the media and trustworthiness in the United States, something like 70% of Americans do not trust the mainstream media. And this is a drop from around 40% only a decade ago. Now, the practical result, of course, the effect of this is that if you don't trust the mainstream media, you don't watch it. If you don't watch it, you don't see the advertisers who support it. If you don't see the advertisers who support it, they don't sell their products as well. And it has now started to catch up with them to the point where CNN, a radical left network, only 6 months ago, has fired its most progressive journalists. People like Brian Stelter, people like John Harwood, people like Don Lemon, they're all gone. And they even had President Trump in for the town hall, which was seriously criticized by the entire left, by much of the rest of CNN, and also by our Vichy conservative friends. They were not happy about this. But to see that on a mainstream network was astonishing. I don't think you would have seen it under the previous leadership, which ironically he was also undone in a sex scandal.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add to that?
Not very much. It just seems that pushing the white supremacy issue is pretty desperate. As Douglas Murray said somewhere, there's never enough right-wingers, right-wing fundamentalists to go around. And this is particularly true in Europe as well. And the other point, is that it is very interesting that Trump's viewing figures on CNN were probably their highest for a while. So I think
I can even tell you what they are on a normal primetime. CNN gets about 500,000 viewers, which is abysmal. When Trump went on for his town hall, they got 3 million.
Let's. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let me now throw open to the list of questions from the floor. This young lady in the red dress will rush to whoever raises their hand. Gentleman in the front row, and another gentleman in the front row. Hi, Steve. How are you? And this gentleman first. Yeah.
First of all, exceptional presentation. Thank you very much. I want to address the elephant in the room, Nazism. I happen to know a lot about Vichy, and I believe the concept is exceptional. Whenever I look at collaboration from that point of view, collaboration with the Nazis, does it make you a Nazi? Soros, for example, he collaborated with the Nazis during World War II, he gave away Jews so Nazis could take properties, blah, blah, blah. Where am I getting at? What is the percentage of Vichy conservatives, more or less, as part of the Republican Party today? That's question one.
Well, as I said in my talk, it's about, they would represent the views of about 10 to 15% of Republicans. Does that mean that 10 to 15% of Republicans are actively Vichy conservative? Probably not. They're just in sympathy. My joke about this is that if all Washington, D.C. Republicans vanished from the face of the earth tomorrow, the Democrats would lose 10,000 more votes in Virginia.
Okay, to continue on this. So if we're looking at Vichy
people.
conservatives as basically being connected to Nazism, do you believe there is a danger that next to the racist etiquette that is being put, I'm personally a MAGA, Trump, or whatever, any way you want to look at. So, okay, so we got a racist. I'm a racist Jew, thank you very much. And then I'm a MAGA, thank you very much. Well, the Vichy think that this will bring water to the people that will try to bring up Nazi, 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 Nazi.
I don't think they're that clever.
No?
No, I think that they're so wrapped up in their own self-absorption that if we start calling them Vichy conservatives, they'll just like get mad and say, "Who's that asshole in Palm Beach who called us Vichy conservatives? That blonde devil."
I think we should be clear that we're not the Vichy conservatives are not appeasing Nazis in the way that Vichy was appeasing Nazism because they lost the war to it. But they are. The conservative leaderships in the past were generally appeasing the left. It's just that defeat was embedded in their outlook. And that's my view. Is that a fair description?
No, I think that's absolutely right. Nobody's arguing that they're appeasing Nazis. They're appeasing a hegemonic force that they can't find any other way to resist. And by collaborating with it, they find a positive way forward for them.
One question, just coming back to Donald Trump. What do you think, how important factor is the behavior? You mentioned that if something was important is his selections, persons who he selected in the government. But on the other hand, if I remember Mike Huckabee's daughter's book before the election, I mean, that was quite negative to Trump in terms of describing his behavior. So from that book, it turned out to be, that he's not really a kind of moral conservative. The other thing is just coming to that, if you would list those, I would say 5 issues in bullet points, what differentiates between the Vichy conservatives and the rest. And one of them is, okay, Trump. The other one is the woke phenomena, the gender. And I would say that it's your free choice, the other 2.
Well, if I could answer your last question first, I think you hit 3 of them. So the woke issues, it's not that they necessarily favor wokeism, it's just that they don't want to resist wokeism. They think it's none of their business. That's something that intellectuals should decide. And we care about economic policy. We're not really into that. So Trump would be another one, and the gender ideology is there as well. I would say also what happens with education in the future. They have essentially no education policy other than let the Democrat functionaries run it at a national level, and we will be less concerned with this. And generally social policy. not the specific ones, but simply not taking any particular role. As for Trump and perceptions of him, yeah, a lot of the memoirs from his administration are quite bad. And there are particular reasons for that. I haven't read Sarah Sanders. I did read and review John Bolton's. And John Bolton seemed to have, the point I made in my review is that he had no problem with Trump until he didn't follow his advice on Iran. And at the point at which he didn't follow his advice on Iran as national security advisor, Trump became the very devil. The other 18 months he was national security advisor, he saw no reason to resign or object or anything. But when it came to the one question of escalating military conflict against the Iranian government, he presented that option, which is the job of the national security advisors. You present the president with options and then enforce the ones he chooses. He didn't choose the one he favored. And as a result of that, he's a bad guy.
Yes, next. Is there someone up there? Oh, yes, that gentleman there. And then, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much. There have been, I think, 3 or 4 interesting figures that have come out of the Vichy conservative wing, what there's left of it, of the Republican Party, that have announced candidacies for presidency. Sort of figures from the 90s, such as Asa Hutchinson and Nikki Haley, the person who calls herself Nikki Haley, and let's see, I think Chris Christie has also announced his interest in running for president. If in fact they have no chance of winning, which I agree they don't, why are they running in the first place?
Well, I would disagree about Nikki Haley. She's actually been very pro-Trump, even including in her presidential race. So, well, that's the difference. But the reason they're running, if you follow the presidential politics, you have these people who have dismal poll numbers yet launch major presidential campaigns. Well, let's look at the Democratic race in 2020. Kamala Harris was a candidate for president. She attacked Joe Biden for being a racist. She attacked Joe Biden when he was accused of sexual harassment by multiple women, said she believed the accusations. She was unable to raise sufficient funds to continue, and as early as December 19, she dropped out of the race. Within 4 months, she went from being politically dead to being the vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party, and she is now vice president of the United States. She went from political death to being one heartbeat away from the presidency itself. All right? And if you go down the list, Pete Buttigieg also ran a dreadful campaign. Well, by endorsing Biden, he got to be transportation secretary. Okay? The mayor of Houston, what was his name? Julian Castro, he gets to be an MSNBC commentator. Right? We have all sorts of ways to reward people who ran for president and lost. It sounds really strange. It's very difficult to explain outside the United States, which I'm trying to do today. But if you should just run for president, even if you lose, that's considered such an achievement. Your notoriety can be at such a level that you could receive a high-level political appointment in a new administration if your votes are decisive enough, or you can become a lucratively paid journalist, you can become a cable news commentator, you can become a columnist in a newspaper. We have cushy professorships of public policy that you can occupy. Some of them become ambassadors, right? There are ways that you can advance your potential future career. And there's always a possibility that you could run for president again someday. How many times did Joe Biden run for president before he won? I think he first ran in 1988. He's been at it for 30 years. And you can finally get the top job. But all you have to do is remain in the public arena, stay in the public eye. And even if you lose, you can be rewarded in ways that wouldn't be even remotely accessible to you if you hadn't run in the first place. It sounds crazy, but that's what it is.
David? No, sorry. Yes, next. Oh, okay. This gentleman, and then this gentleman.
Okay. You may not know that the former ambassador in the 90s to Hungary was Donald Blinken. That's Tony's dad.
I do know that, yes.
Okay. I knew Donald very well. And Donald told me in 2015, December, that no matter any of the candidates, the 17 candidates at the time that were going to run, they were going to have the dirtiest election they ever seen in their life. And I said, I was on leadership for Pennsylvania, Republican. So we still had a nice little chat a lot. But I said to him, Donald, why are you guys doing this? And he told me, he said, George, you really want to know? He said, because Hillary has done so many bad things in her career that we have to have a diversion, and a diversion away from it. And it didn't matter who was going to run, they were going to become a Russian agent. Oh, any of those 17 people were going to become Russian agents. You wait and see. So that was what was going on. Now, let's go forward now in the future now. We're talking about diversion, and we're talking about what's the reaction to Hungary. Hungary has taken some tough positions in the EU. And there's a lot of diversion going on about Hungary by not only the other side, the leftist side of this country, of this continent, but also by some of your Vichy people that are hanging around. I'd like to have your comments on that.
What the Vichy people think of Hungary? Yes. Oh, they despise Hungary. They identify Hungary with illiberalism, and they associate Hungarian government policies under Orban with what they think Trump would do and with what they believe DeSantis is doing in Florida. And they're saying that Republicans, American Republicans who see anything positive in Hungary are, the words they use are nihilists. Oh, exactly. Looking around at how beautiful Budapest is now, it's like the anti-New York to me. And it's like, I have a place in New York. My neighborhood is gone. But Budapest is pleasant, orderly, clean. You can walk the streets at night. You used to be able to walk the streets of New York at night. Not anymore. Well, not without risk. So they think that if you're signed up to the Orban project or think even anything remotely favorable about it, you're a nihilist. You're against the Constitution of the United States. You oppose democracy. You've sold your soul. Anne Applebaum, actually, she compared them to leftist intellectuals who went to the Soviet Union. In the 1920s and 30s, and came back with favorable reports about how great Stalinism is. And she's like, well, they're just like those people who did Stalin's bidding then. They're doing Orban's bidding now. It's really nasty. And I think part of the reason why they're so vitriolic is because they realize, to borrow a phrase, that it can happen here or there in America, that populist conservative nationalism is a force that not only has some validity and legitimate popularity, but also rejects them and would consign them to, I think I call it the vast pasture land of worthless Washington, D.C. institutes, which is impressive indeed, but has very little power. So it's the end for them if anything like this should ever succeed.
Good, thank you. David?
Yeah, just to add on to that, I mean, part of the problem with the Vichy conservatives is that they believe in a progressive moral unfolding that is taking place universally. And anybody on the West who stands, for something nationalist or conservative is an evil force. It's not that he's just a conservative representative of people. There's something about Orban that seems to be able to signify to a progressive agenda, not just in America, but in the UK or in any other Anglospheric country, that Orban seems to have occupied a role that is quite unique, really.
On the question which was raised a bit ago, just to throw my 2 cents in, I would say if you're looking for an issue which is absolutely identifies the Vichy conservatives versus the rest, it is affirmative action. And that's been around since the late 60s, early 70s, and progressively the Vichy conservatives have abandoned a principled opposition to it, even though a principled opposition to it is the position of about 70% of the American voters, maybe more. Finally, this gentleman.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned that foreign and security policy doesn't win elections, but for us Europeans, it's of course of utmost importance what future US foreign and security policy will be, because there's a fairly good chance that Russia's war in Ukraine will continue next year, that we definitely will have a totally different security architecture in Europe, which will be definitely one against Russia. And I'm very interested in what's the discourse in Florida among Republicans, among conservatives on Russia, on Russia's war in Ukraine, on NATO. I do not want to cite John Bolton, who said that if Trump would have won the elections, he would have left NATO. But he was definitely critical vis-à-vis NATO at that time. Has this changed among conservatives in the US, in Florida?
Well, what we hear from both Governor DeSantis and from Donald Trump recently, they've both pronounced on the issue. They have declared that, in their opinion, the war in Ukraine is outside the immediate interest of the United States. And it sounds like a great clash with what you read in the American media. In fact, David French was in the New York Times. Vichy French was in the New York Times today arguing that the time has come to give Ukraine F-16 fighter aircraft. Trump's position, as well as DeSantis's, is that it lies outside America's interest because there's no alliance relationship with Ukraine. There's no NATO agreement with Ukraine. And since when has who called the shots in Donetsk or even in Kiev mattered to American interest? Never, right? Trump's position, which he said in his CNN town hall recently, was that he wants the war to stop, that they want the conflict to end because they realize it's a destabilizing event. And the more destabilized it is, the greater the possibility is for a potential nuclear confrontation, which would be catastrophic for a whole host of reasons. That's something I think they'd prefer to stay out of. The position on NATO, I think, was always rather caricatured. I don't believe Trump ever intended to leave or abandon NATO. His critique was that certain European NATO countries weren't paying contributions to the alliance according to agreed-upon benchmarks, and that he believes a major achievement of his administration was to convince them to make those payments, or at least get on schedules that would allow them to rise to, I think, 2% of GDP for defense spending. Well, it likely was, but the truth is, I'm friends with the man who was ambassador to NATO during that time. And he told me, when I talked to my colleagues, they said, you're being awfully hard on us. And it's like, it's all about the money, isn't it? And privately, it's all about the money. We just don't want to pay it. But Trump would withhold economic deals and things like this, and they would present that as political pressure that was anti-alliance. But in fact, it was meant to strengthen the alliance. And I don't believe there was any serious attempt to dissolve it. I think you're right that with the invasion of Ukraine, it did wake up a lot of people who had been more ambivalent in Europe, and that it became a much more sort of consolidated alliance. Now, of course, we see Finland and Sweden coming in as members, whereas only a few years ago, huge majorities of their population opposed it. And it seems like even countries like Turkey, which have more ambivalent relationships with Russia, are coming back toward NATO in that way. But that's, I think, a result of the conflict. So I hope that answers.
David?
I think it's interesting that the likely Republican candidates are showing very great reluctance about continuing to aid Ukraine in the way the Americans have been. And this is, in many ways an American proxy war. So the consequences of what happens next year are going to be, very, very interesting for the region. And I think the big worry going forward is, Russia is a nuclear power, and people are not paying enough attention to the the nuclear possibilities that could be on the cards by next year?
I'd like to just examine this question from the standpoint of American strategists and American conservatives who think that China is the greater, more significant threat, and this is a distraction, this war. I think if the Russians were to win the war in any way, really, that would be an enormous defeat for the West. And the fact is, I believe that this is in some respects an American proxy war, but it's an American proxy war that the Russians started by invading Ukraine. And the question was, what would we do? Well, had the Russians triumphed easily as they expected to, and as I think many of people in the West expected, we probably would not have done a great deal. We probably have done what we did last time in 2014, which is to take a strong rhetorical stand, which is gradually ebbs away. But the fact is, the Ukrainians ensured that we couldn't do that, and they defended their country. They've done it well. The support we have given them rhetorically has been strong. We have given, and different countries have given different levels of support. The Americans and the Brits have done most European countries have not. The position that Paul was suggesting, was outlining about that Trump would take, is the same as Viktor Orban's, and Viktor Orban's position is a perfectly reasonable one, in the sense that if you think the war is a disaster for everybody, then let's stop it. And then there'll be discussions. And at this point, if that were to happen, I don't think it would be a Russian victory at this point. But on the other hand, for that reason, Putin may decide he wants to carry on a bit longer and create the circumstances in which talks would be a Russian victory. So there are not very comfortable choices for the West now. But on the other hand, I think from the standpoint of Beijing, an American defeat would be a huge gain in the world, and would certainly not make them more pacific. It would mean that the Russians would be suddenly a more effective ally, and a more important ally, and whatever they had paid for in blood and treasure, which is a great deal, they would nonetheless have helped Chinese interests in a way which a Russian defeat or a stalemate that amounts to having wasted all of these lives and treasure in order for not much of an advance. That is something that the Chinese would certainly find. The Chinese would regard the Russians as a vassal rather than an ally in those circles.
Notice how weakly the Chinese support the Russian invasion. With the recent visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow, they wouldn't endorse a unilateral Russian victory.
And they won't even give them any arms.
They won't give them arms. That Russia has to rely on North Korea for arms and ammunition. That's pretty sad. And I think the general military consensus is that Russia cannot win. Now, does that mean the Ukrainians will beat them? I think that's also far beyond their ability. Yeah. So I have argued since it began, I agree very much with what Henry Kissinger said the week it started. The likely resolution is probably a negotiated settlement that nobody really likes. And that in itself serves Russian interests, because Russia's entire project in Ukraine has been to deny it membership in the West, either economically or militarily. If Ukraine remains territorially disintegrated, as it would in such a settlement, then it can't join NATO or the EU. Not until you have completely resolved borders can you become a member of either entity, right? So keep a frozen conflict in place, just like they do in Georgia, by the way, another potential NATO member. Make sure that their territorial integrity is in question and they can never really move against you, as they say it.
I think that's true, but I don't think the West would accept that, actually. In other words, they would have done at an earliest, before the invasion, but now I don't think they would. I think they will insist that an independent Ukraine might not become a member of NATO, but it would have access to advanced weaponry sold to them.
In fact, early on, even Zelensky's government said, okay, we'll accept the loss of Crimea and things that we know we cannot take back militarily, and we'll actually put a neutrality clause in our constitution saying that we'll never join NATO. We just want to have an independent Ukraine.
And then we have an interesting
They've
question.
backed off on that since.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, obviously, a lot of things are up for grabs, but if we think about it this way, in 1955, the Russians pull out, and they insist of Austria, and they insist that Austria can't join NATO. Well, that it didn't. Now, 10 years later, actually, I didn't come here 10 years later, but I went to Austria about sort of a little more than that. Austria plainly was a fully fledged member of the West in everything except the military sense. And it would be the aim of Western policy, I think, after such a settlement here, to make Ukraine into a fully fledged member of the West in every way except the military, which they would have forsworn. And I think if that were to happen, that would in the end be a huge defeat for Russia, because among other things, the Russians would begin to look at Ukraine the way the East Germans looked at West Germany and thought, what were we doing wrong that they've ended up so much better off than we have?
I think that actually was part of Putin's motivation in trying to squash out Ukraine, was that it was actually starting to look like a better and more pluralistic society than Russia. And that seeing the commonalities historically and now this sharp difference was offensive to him.
Any more questions? Oh, the lady in the back. And this will have to be the last question.
Thank you very much. And my question will be an easy one. Vichy has this twofold bad connotation, bad association with Nazism and collaboration. So why did you pick this peculiar word to describe your concept? I have an idea, but I want to hear yours. You.
I'd like to hear your idea first.
There are so many people who are describing themselves as the good guys, but with this name you are describing this concept as the bad guys concept. And that is more interesting, that piques my interest. But everybody describing themselves as good guys, so that's it has some marketing idea maybe behind it, but it's something that draws my interest.
You are absolutely right. A+. It might interest you in the room to know that my early academic work had to do with the performing arts in late imperial Russia. So everything's theater. And to pick a funny metaphor, yes, we have other ones. Sometimes we call them rhinos or Republicans in name only, right? It's like an acronym, like NATO. Right? What else do we call them? Quisling sometimes, yeah, we use that term too. Yeah, Quisling, you really have to know about Norway to know who Quisling was. In America, no, the people are aware of who he is. In fact, we use the word Quisling in English as a synonym for traitor. It's in the dictionary. But I thought Vichy France people would know it from the film Casablanca. Of course, we have one of the leading ones has the unfortunate last name French. So Vichy French. And it just struck me at the moment when there were those comments about the American right-wing people coming to Hungary that it seemed like their opponents were so agitated and so angry that the real sources of what they were trying to achieve were revealed. Right? If you get very angry, protest too much, then you can see what they're trying to do. And Vichy just fit. It was a label, perhaps, controversial, maybe, theatrical, definitely provocative. I didn't found the Palm Beach Freedom Institute to be sensitive. Okay. Wow. I'm going to tell them you applauded it.
At this point, I want to thank Paul, David, and everyone who asked questions. I think questions nomenclature aside, which I think are very interesting, and I think Vichyism is a synonym, I think, for defeatism in my view, and collaborationism is a slightly different concept, of course, but there is a tremendous reason why I think Vichy has echoes and awkward ones at the moment here is because the atmosphere of pessimism in Western society and the uncertainty of how to deal with the woke revolution, all of these things have created atmospheres of a feeling of seriously deep anxiety in our societies, which I don't recall at earlier stages, even stages of great crisis. And that's what is interesting.
If I could add something to that, John.
Yeah.
A friend of mine's running for Congress in 24, and he's most famous for writing a letter denouncing woke ideology in his daughter's private school in New York City. All right. And one of the things he told me when I saw him before I left on this trip was that in those environments, in the blue state city environments, parents are now afraid of becoming alienated from their children. Because if they say what they truly feel to their woke educated children, they feel the children will reject them and cut them off and they'll never see them again.
Yes.
Right, so it is a fact, it's become so personal and so much a part of your daily life that in some cases to be anything other than a Vichy conservative is not a sensible solution.
This is becoming a committee meeting, of course, but I want to just tell Paul that one of the things that I'm interested in, and we will do it at some point here, is to look at the Dostoevsky novel, The Devils, or The Possessed, because that is absolutely deals with the phenomenon you just mentioned, which is parents who are afraid of their children and alienated from them by revolutionary ideas. There is, incidentally, for those of you who are interested, I think you can get it online. In 1968, of all years, the BBC ran a 5-part serial based. Well, it was the Possessed, and it's in black and white, of course, color television not having arrived. As I recall, and I read it at the time, it sort of persuaded me to read the book and more Dostoevsky. It's an absolutely wonderful production and is well worth watching and indeed becoming the basis for discussion. And I think that's one of the things we'll try and do. So, thank you, all of you, for asking questions. Paul, thank you for stimulating an extremely interesting discussion. David, thank you for weighing in with your normal acerbic observations. So thanks, all of you, and thank them.